Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, John. I think for folks, we're just waiting for a few more folks to join us.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. How are you this morning?
Good. How's everybody?
We are well.
Is the place to sit?
Yep.
Am I still gonna be?
You want to stand?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I thought this would be in the way.
Well, now we can see you, not just your tie.
Good. Good. Thanks for yawning, I see. Okay. Is everybody's on there?
We've got a number of committee members on, and we're promoting some folks right now, but we'll probably maybe give it to 9:32.
Hey, Erin, Leanne's here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
I'm good. I am starting, I've got a meeting with John.
Good morning. We will probably get started in just 1 minute. You should be able to mute yourself. We've highlighted on the screen how to do that. We'll just ask folks to keep themselves muted to reduce the background noise.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Aaron, we good to go?
I think we are good to go, and I just wanted to let you know that after you call the meeting to order, I'll go ahead and do roll call so that we know who else is on. Great.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everyone. So I'd like to call the meeting of the MPO Policy Committee to order. So Aaron, if you would go ahead and do a roll call, I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So Secretary Osmond? Present?
Yes.
From the tollway? CDOT? Chicago?
Can you hear me?
Yep. we can. Representing CMAP? I know we have, is Frank Beal on the line?
Yes, Frank Beal.
And President Brawley, thank you. RTA?
Dan Redden's here.
DTA? Metro?
Connolly's there, audio only.
Okay, we'll check in with Connolly and see if he needs assistance. Metro?
Jared Nowinski.
Pace?
Rocky Daniel.
Cook County?
John Yonan.
Great. DuPage County?
Chris Snyder.
Kane County?
Tom Rickert.
Kendall County? Lake County?
Schneider.
McHenry County?
Scott Hennings.
Thank you. Will County?
Nick Palmer.
FHWA? I believe we have Arlene on the line. We will double check.
Aaron, it's Scott Keppel. I'm here for Kendall County. I was unable to unmute earlier.
Great, thank you. I think we needed to promote you to panelist, so thank you, Scott. FTA, Region 5? And anyone, let's see, the railroads.
Eric Varela with Union Pacific.
Great, sounds good. I think that concludes our roll call this morning. We have a quorum, so I'll ask that we go forward. Oh, Council of Mayors, I'm sorry, thank you, Mayor Schilke. We're good to go.
Unmute him.
Great. And thank you, Aaron. And good morning once again. Would like to see, are there any changes to the agenda?
No changes that we've received.
Okay. If there are no changes, I'd like to make a couple of announcements, please. And a statement, rather. What I really want to talk about is about the recent civil unrest. And I just wanted to highlight that the recent civil unrest have not been missed by the department. I think we are in a unique position, and we do have a unique opportunity with Rebuild Illinois to review our policies and procedures and to try to improve our consideration of how our work affects disadvantaged communities and what we can do to support them. We have already taken some small steps by including projects that affect disadvantaged communities as a prioritization factor. For example, for the SPR program, We are moving ahead with 100% funding for these projects. You will see more of that effort from the department in the coming months. But another announcement I really want to talk about, and it's a sad occasion for us. I want to take this moment and this opportunity for our group here to recognize Larry Walsh, who passed away last week. As a member of this committee, as a county executive for Will County, and for a lifetime public service, we thank him for his service to the people of Will County, this region, and the state of Illinois. I would like us to take a moment of silence for Larry. We do send our regards to his family and to those who have worked with him in Will County government. He will be missed. And most of you might know today is the visitation and the funeral in Manhattan. I'm in Springfield today, and hopefully I'll make it there. I think it's between 2 and 8 o'clock. And if you would like a copy of the obituary, I'll send it out to whoever is on this call. But moving on, though, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes from March 12, 2020.
Leanne Redden moves.
Second, Yonan.
Okay. Motion is seconded. If there is no question, all of those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed signify by a vote of no. And the motion carries. And now to item number 4, which is dealing with the agency report. I'd like to start with the Executive Director report for CMAP. Ms. Elliman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So, as you noted, we are really in the midst of 2 ongoing and interconnected events. We've got a global pandemic, and we've got a sustained and persistent push for equal treatment of Black and Brown Americans across our country. And we believe that as the MPO for the region and as the regional planning agency, this will truly impact our work and our needs for the future of our region. So, as I wrote in my weekly email last week, that I truly believe the principles of the On2 2050 plan, inclusive growth, prioritized investment, and resiliency are even more important than ever. And our local governments are going to have less resources and will need greater assistance in the coming years. So yesterday, I'll just note that I participated in a call with our national associations, the National Association of Regional Councils, the National League of Cities, and the National Association of Counties. And one of the concerns expressed by all of these organizations is the fact that government is going to contract due to limited budget, and their focus on the need to deliver those essential services the governments are there for. And one of the things that tends to go by the wayside is planning and long-range planning. But this is really where CMAP can step in and play a strong role. There isn't another type of organization that's sole mission is to help with long-range planning across our region. So this is our mandate to serve local communities, and we take that very seriously and hope to bring our resources to assist the communities across our region in new ways moving forward. So today we are bringing to the MPO the Unified Work Program budget for your approval. One change, while the total dollar amounts have not changed, we have gone through the program itself on our budget side and figured out a way for us to really be responsive to the impacts of COVID, and built in some space for us to be able to work with regional partners on issues like congestion mitigation and transit recovery and all of the sorts of things that I know that you all at your organizations are discussing every day. A couple other things I just wanted to talk about. We'll talk more about the UWP program on your agenda here, but just, we've been working to support the city's COVID recovery task force, and we've been working in partnership with them to gather data on how municipalities have been responding to the pandemic. We've surveyed and gotten information from over 200 of our 284 municipalities. And, one of the things that I think is pretty obvious is that no one is untouched by the pandemic. But most importantly, some of the key takeaways from the survey really support the fact that our region is interconnected in terms of how people get to and from work, and that we need to work together on our transportation issues, on our economic development issues, which is closely tied to how people get around in our region. And then thinking about partnerships for local governments, like service sharing and modernizing funding streams for local governments as well. So we will take that feedback and continue to use it to help define our program next year, or this next fiscal year. So the other two things that I wanted to touch on, one was closely related, is just this regional workforce and why Northeastern Illinois is considered one region. So right before the stay-at-home orders, most of the workers in the Chicago region, 56% of them commuted across county boundaries on a daily basis to get to work or to the places that they need to go. This really knits our communities together. And I know that I, certainly don't think about whose county boundaries or whose municipal boundaries I'm crossing when I'm on the roads or when I'm on transit as well. But, I think that us as transportation planners and experts in the field, can really use this information to figure out how we can help with recovery. So I'll just highlight that while 36.5% of Chicago residents reverse commute out to a suburban community out of the city, 2/3 of the residents in Will County, McHenry County, Kane and Kendall counties cross these boundaries to work every day. So, and we know that people are coming from Wisconsin and Indiana and Grundy and Kankakee and DeKalb as well into our region. So, I think recovery is going to have to take into consideration a number of these trends, and we'll see what happens in terms of people's comfort and ability to move around in the region when things start to reopen as we move from phase 3 to phase 4 in the next few weeks, we hope. So on a lighter note, we do have our Future Leaders of Planning program happening this year, and we are looking forward to it. We've transitioned, like many programs right now, to a digital-only experience for young people across the region. We'll be holding it virtually through Zoom conference calls. And we're doing something a little bit different too, that it's open to not just high school students, but it's also open to college students in Northeastern Illinois. So again, it's always free. We'll be holding sessions on Thursdays. And then we will be talking about planning for urban street festivals, drinking water, planning amidst COVID-19 and inequalities in urban planning. So it's a great way to get young people engaged and exposed to transportation planning and community-based planning as well. So if you know young people that might be interested, we'd be happy to have you share the word about that. So that concludes my remarks, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Erin. Are there any questions or comments of what Erin just talked about? Thank you. Now to the CMAP board report. Leon Redden.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll be brief. There's been 3 CMAP board meetings since our last MPO meeting, and several of the items that have been discussed at the board are also on today's agenda, so I won't go into detail on those. But the board, the most distant meeting was April 8th. We went through, staff presented the FY 2021 budget and work plan for initial review. And Erin touched on that, but the MPO does not actually consider that item. The proposed Onto 2050 plan amendments were also presented, and staff gave a federal legislative update that included the description of the CARES Act legislation that passed, and a brief state legislative summary and update was given also. The board also met on May 13th. Staff shared some of the work that it had done since the start of the pandemic, and that included topics in the weekly update related to flooding, essential work, other emergency responses. Following the presentation, staff also asked for feedback from the board on a number of questions posed to sort of stimulate some discussion related to the pandemic and recovery. And I think we're going to have some of that discussion maybe with this group today as well. Finally, the board met again yesterday. That was June 10th. Covered a number of items that are on the agenda. The approval of the 2021 Unified Work Program that Erin already mentioned. Approval of CMAP's FY 2021 budget and work plan, Aaron mentioned that as well. The semi-annual onto 2050 TIP conformity and TIP amendment. And then the onto 2050 plan amendments associated with conformity analysis, and they included the improvements of the I-55 at Airport Lockport Road and Illinois 126, improvements to I-55 from I-80 to US 52, and US 52 from River Road to Hobart Road. They also named a nominating committee to name officers and members to the executive committee. I think this group will be doing something similar related to the MPO for later today. And then staff gave a brief state legislative update. The board also will take the summer off and not meet again until September. So that concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions or comment on Leon's report? Great, thank you, Leon.
That was easy.
Now to the Council of Mayors report, and that's for Mayor Shelkey to give us a report on that, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir. The April 14th Council of Mayors Executive Committee was conducted using the GOTOMEETING online. The committee was updated on STP funding availability through the end of the federal fiscal year. All projects that were scheduled for IDOT's June letting are funded. The committee approved staff recommended processes for prioritizing remaining federal fiscal year projects for funding should additional funds become available. There was no other business before the committee. The next meeting is scheduled for August 18th, 2020. That's the report. I just want to add that I think in conversations I've had with a number of mayors throughout the region, that there is a growing appreciation and admiration for CMAP and its staff and its new executive director. Some of the ideas that have been put forth, and I know one of the things I guess we're trying to do is kind of watch the events surrounding our current situations and maybe even begin to try to put together some kind of a written history so that, you know, 50, 100 years from now, if something like this happens again, there'll be some strong exercises of history that can be reviewed, and maybe some ideas that were put out today will be good in 2070 or whenever it would be. But I just think it's great that the proactive stance that this organization has taken, and certainly the professionalism that it brings to the region, where we have people who have been educated and trained in, you know, public transportation and the whole transportation agenda. And I think this is just all going to make for a much stronger and more strengthful region in the days ahead. So on behalf of the Council of Mayors, I just want to pass that compliment on to the CMAP staff. Thank you.
That's great, and I wholeheartedly agree. I guess I'm hoping to be there in 2070, though, Mr. Mayor. We're going to move on to item 5, and that's the nominating committee for the office of vice chair. As we all know, each year we appoint a nominating committee to select a vice chairman. This year, I do appoint the Tollway Executive Director, Jose Alvarez, representing Highway Administration. Representing the Council of Mayors is Council of Mayor Chairman, Mayor Jeff Shelkey, representing Municipal Government. Pace, Chairman Rick Pnowski, representing Transit Agency. Kendall County Chairman, Scott Grider, representing counties. Board Member, Frank Beal, representing the Regional Planning Agency. Thank you all for agreeing to serve. Thank you. Now to item 6, which is the FY 2021 Unified Work Program, and that will be for Aaron Alaman to talk about. So Aaron, please.
Well, thank you. So yesterday, as we mentioned, the CMAP board met and approved the FY21 Unified Work Program and the comprehensive CMAP budget and work plan, which includes our resources from other grant funds as well. So each year we ask the MPO to approve the region's Unified Work Program. UWP funding marks come from the FAST Act 5-year transportation bill, and federal funding through FAST Act is estimated to be at $18.8 million for FY21, and an increase of about $650,000 from FY 2020. So there's slight growth built into the FAST Act, but with the required match, which IDOT provides, the total UWP program for FY21 is estimated to be just under $23.5 million for the region here. So these funds are allocated to CMAP, our transportation partners, for their participation in the regional planning process and programming activities. And then annually, we do a competitive call for projects that can be completed in a 5-year time frame for our regional transportation partners. So CMAP requested about $18.8 million for federal or for fiscal year 2021. The UWP committee is recommending the following proposals and amounts be approved. So the total competitive funding award for 21 is $595,000. 2 projects were selected: CDOT's Central Business District Multimodal Demand Assessment, which comes in at about $300,000, which reflects the federal funds and the local match, and Metra's Downtown Connection Studies for $295,000, which also is inclusive of the federal funds and the local match there. So I am seeking MPO approval for the FY 2021 UWP budget. Happy to answer questions, and I know Angela is also on the line as well.
Well, thank you, Aaron. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the FY 2021 Unified Work Program.
So moved from GSCDOT.
Do I have a second?
Second,
Second.
Council Mayors.
Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. Moving on to the next item, which is item 7, and that's the semi-annual onto 2050/TIP conformity of analysis. I would like Mr. Russell of CMAP to go. Thank you.
All right, included in your packet today are 2 conformity amendments, the first of which is the onto 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-06. As you know, the CMAP region is a non-attainment area for ozone. Thus, we are required to demonstrate that projects in the TIP conform to the motor vehicle emissions budget for our area through a regional emissions analysis. Specifically, projects in the TIP subject to air quality analysis must demonstrate, when modeled, that the region is not exceeding our motor vehicle emissions budget, which is shown on the last page of the memo in your packet. The memo includes information about new projects along with various changes to existing projects that are part of the regional air quality analysis. It was subject to a 30-day public comment period from April 10th to May 11th, during which time CMAP did not receive any public comments. Our analysis demonstrates that the semi-annual onto 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-06 are found to conform to the motor vehicle emissions budget for our region. At this time, staff requests approval of the semi-annual onto 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-06 as presented. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Petroviak. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the TIP conformity analysis and amendment.
So move DuPage County.
Thank you.
Second,
Do I have?
yay.
Okay. Motion is second. Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. Now moving on to item 8, which is the FY 2020 CARES Act Federal Transit Administration FTA funding. I would like Terry Dixon of CMAP to highlight this item.
Good morning, everyone. The MPO is asking to endorse and approve the FTA funding splits between Northwestern Indiana and Northeastern Illinois, as well as the funding split for Southeastern Wisconsin and Northeastern Illinois. These additional funds were allocated under the CARES Act. The RTA worked with the staffs at Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission and the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission to agree on the funding allocations. On April 16th, the RTA board approved the funding splits and service allocations. These funds are being used for operations. A memo summarizing the splits was included in your meeting materials. Resolutions have been prepared and staff request your approval for these resolutions. So if there are any questions, I can answer those for you.
Thank you, Terry. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the FY 2020 CARES Act FTA sub-area allocation between Northwestern Indiana, Northwestern Illinois, and Southeastern Wisconsin, Northeastern Illinois.
So moved by the Council of Mayors.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second by Yonan.
Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 All those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. Now moving on to the next item, which is item 9, and that is on to 2050 Plan Amendment. Mr. Elam, if you would like to entertain us with this item.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll try to be entertaining. So just to remind you, CMAP has, we've got 2 amendments, or 2 potential amendments for your consideration this morning. And both of them are in the I-55 corridor, close together in Will County. And just for background, you know, one of the federal requirements for doing a long-range transportation plan like on to 2050 is that we need to show what the transportation system is going to look like in the future and how it's going to be paid for. And so because that's a big task to do that over 30 years, we try to make it practical by just focusing the discussion on certain project investments that are over a threshold. And we call that those projects regionally significant projects, or RSPs. Those projects have to be specifically itemized in the plan, and if they weren't itemized in the plan, then they become amendments, which is what we're considering today. So I'm going to be asking for your approval of these 2 projects. We did an evaluation of them earlier in the spring, and then that was released for public comment. We got public comments back, most of which were in support of the project, sometimes with specific design and construction phasing recommendations. We also got some comments back from our nonprofit partners about the evaluation techniques we used. All those comments are summarized in a memo that was included in your packet. So I'll be looking for separate votes on these projects. So I'm going to start first with the northern one, I-55 at Airport Lockport Road in Illinois 126. So this is a project that adds a new service interchange at Airport Lockport Road. It also reconstructs the existing interchange at Illinois 126, as well as converting it from a partial to a full interchange. So staff, the way we do these evaluations is we look at how the project fits with first the overall on to 2050 principles of inclusive growth, resilience, and prioritized investment. We also look at how it fits in with the specific recommendations of individual chapters in the project, in the plan. So we find that the project's biggest connection to onto 2050 is in the prioritized investment area. It meets several mobility needs in the corridor, including aiding freight movement, cutting congestion. It also would address some pretty significant safety problems in the area. We find the project also supports existing communities by enhancing infrastructure in an already developed corridor. We also think it's going to help meet the goal of robust economic growth that reduces inequality. That is because of the support that this project would give to the Will County freight cluster. In particular, that's the better access that it would give to industrial areas that are just to the west in Plainfield and just to the east in Romeoville. We also find that the project would provide bike ped accommodations that exist right now. So we're also required to evaluate whether the project can fit under the region's fiscal constraint, which is really just another way of saying, do we have enough money for it? And so when we do that analysis, we look in particular at the cost of new capacity in the project, which in this case is the new interchange movements and anything really as part of this project that didn't already exist. So we find that the new capacity costs of this project are pretty small. They can also be accommodated, we think, by just shifting budget from the part of the financial plan that we call system enhancements. So the long and short of that is that including this amendment would not push out any other project that's already in on to 2050. So with that, I am seeking your approval to add the I-55 at Airport Lockport Road and Illinois 126 project to onto 2050.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you for going through all the three items. But before we get there, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I'm very happy that at least some of the CARES Act are being delivered to our region, specifically on transit and aeronautic side. We are at the department. We are very hopeful that at least for the highways, they're going to be DC, Washington DC, will be in a position to deliver at least some backstop funding for us to plug the gap on what we see on the decline in revenue. So we are hoping at some point in time, perhaps prior to December 30th, which is the end of the federal fiscal year, we'll see some action on the federal side. Let me talk just a little bit about the Department of IDOT multi-year program. As you know, we have unveiled our multi-year program last year in around October, which is typically late for us, but that was related to the capital bill. That was signed on at the tail end of May of last year. This year, we are moving forward we're going to be announcing our new multi-year program in a few weeks. One note I wanted to make is we do talk a lot about declining revenue, but my commitment has always been the multi-year program we have announced and the list of projects we have announced last year is not to be changed. We are not deleting any project whatsoever. Yet, due to decline in revenue, what we most likely will see is the 6-year plan perhaps being a 7-year plan or an 8-year plan, meaning some of the projects will be delayed. But the department commitment is we have committed to what we have unveiled last October, and those projects are all intact. But we do appreciate, another point I wanted to make, I really do appreciate the hard work between District 1 and CMAP of reviewing all the projects that Jesse just talked about. Taking all three projects separately, starting with 9.1, item 9.1, which is the improvement to I-55 at Airport Lockport Road and Illinois 6. Do I have a motion? I will entertain a motion to amend and include the project listed in item 9.1. With that, you, Mayor Sharkey, you might need to unmute.
I will make the motion in support of that.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second, this is Nick Palmer from Will County.
Thank you, Nick. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. Now we're going to move on to item 9.2, and Jesse, if you would don't mind going through item 9.2.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I'll just do the same thing now for this other project. I'm going to shorthand it as the I-55 at Illinois 59 Access Project. It's similar to the last one that we just discussed. The project does, again, invest in existing communities by building out the remaining legs of an existing interchange. In terms of fit with Honda 2050, again, the strongest connection to our principles is really prioritized investment. The project addresses some pretty significant mobility challenges in the area. Again, some fairly substantial safety issues on the existing legs of the interchange and up and down 55 in the area. We also find that this project would help to a more limited degree with inclusive growth and resilience. I should also note that part of the project directly supports a new development, which is at the northeast, or would be at the northeastern corner of I-55 and I-80, which is right now largely surrounded by existing built-up land. The I-55 at Illinois 59 Access Project, we think will have positive impacts on the regional economy by supporting the Will County freight cluster. Quantitative evaluation of the project suggests that the project location also has some pretty significant safety and congestion and reliability issues relative to other places where we've got RSPs already. I would argue this project is also a good example of something that we call for in the governance chapter of Honda 2050, which is having partnerships between multiple governments and multiple layers or levels of governments to deliver infrastructure projects. So in this case, we have the state and several local governments working together, and this project has wound up with 2 local partners actually leading parts of the project. As with the northern project that we discussed earlier, we also think that the new capacity elements of this project, they're small. They can also be accommodated by shifting budget from the system enhancements part of the financial plan and wouldn't push anything else out of Honda 2050. So with that, I'm seeking your approval to add the I-55 at Illinois 59 Access Project to the plan.
Thank you, Jesse. I'll entertain a motion to amend onto 2050 and include the project listed in item 9.2.
Moved by the Council of Mayors.
Second by Yonan.
Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. On to next item, which is item 9.3. Once again, Jesse, Ellen, if you don't mind going through that item for us.
Mr. Secretary, I'm actually going to call on Russell to do that. Basically, we need a vote to show that we can add these 2 projects to the plan and still meet our air quality requirements. So, Russell, you on the line?
I am ready to go. Okay, included in your packet is the conformity analysis for the 2 regionally significant projects shown in the semi-annual Onto 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-03.1 memo. As has already been mentioned, in the region is a non-attainment area for ozone. Thus, we are required to demonstrate that projects in the TIP conform to the motor vehicle emissions budget for our area through a regional emissions analysis. As has already been mentioned today, projects in the TIP subject to air quality analysis requirements must demonstrate when modeled that the region does not exceed our motor vehicle emissions budget, which is shown on the last page of the memo in your packet. I want to mention that The analysis for the two RSP projects includes all the changes in the previous conformity memo, 20-06, which you just approved about 10 minutes ago. We do the analysis of the TIP conformity amendments, and then we take those results and incorporate them into the analysis we did for the two plan amendments, so that our analysis is done using the most current TIP information. The memo shown in your packet was subject to a 30-day public comment period from April 10th to May 11th, during which time CMAP did not receive any public comments on the conformity memo. Our analysis demonstrates that the semi-annual ON-TO 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-03.1 are found to conform to the motor vehicle emissions budget for our region. Staff requests approval of the ON-TO 2050 TIP conformity analysis and TIP amendment 20-03.1 as presented. If there are any questions, I can answer them at this time.
Okay, thank you, Russell. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the TIP conformity analysis and amendment that includes the project identified in items 9.1 and 9.2.
So moved, Leanne Redden.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second, Kendall County.
Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed signify by a vote of no. The motion carries. Now moving on to item 10, which is COVID-19 response and recovery effort. And Erin talked a little bit about it earlier, so would appreciate it if you could go through that item for us.
Great. Thank you. You know, one of the things we did at a previous board meeting was talk a little bit about the travel impacts and revenue impacts from COVID-19. So I believe that we have Lindsay Hollander and Craig Heather from our team who are going to give just a brief overview of some of the initial analysis that we've done internally.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I'll start us off. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty around how long the pandemic's going to last, about how quickly the economy is going to be able to recover, and really about how soon people will return to their pre-COVID activities. So we'd just like to share a little bit of the information that we've been collecting on how the pandemic has impacted both our travel and transportation revenue in the region. So I'll start us off by discussing some of the impacts we're seeing on the transportation system. So if we can move to the next slide. One more. And we'll take a look at traffic volumes. So this chart is looking at traffic on Wednesdays in March through May of this year, using data from IDOT's count classification sensors. The yellow line is showing us all traffic combined, and we can see the largest declines in volumes occurred at the end of March, shortly after the stay-at-home order was in effect, where volumes were down 42% from normal levels. They did start slowly rebounding during April, and by the end of that month, they were only down 37%. And then during May, we've actually been seeing them increase even faster. So at the end of May, overall traffic was down 24% from its normal levels. Now we're seeing that the impact is very different depending on the types of vehicles that we're talking about. So passenger vehicles have seen the most dramatic declines in volumes, and these are shown by the blue line on the chart. So you can see at the end of March, they were down 47%, but they have steadily been climbing up. So by the end of May, they were only down 26% below normal. We've been seeing some very different patterns when we've been looking at trucks. Let me start with the orange line there, which represents single unit trucks. These are the small and medium sized trucks that usually are used for deliveries within local markets. These volumes were down 27% again at the end of March. But since then, they've steadily climbed back up, so that by the end of May, they are actually essentially back at their pre-COVID traffic volumes. And finally, for the gray line, which shows combination trucks. These are tractor trailers. Their volume was down 10% at the end of March, and since then has fairly consistently stayed in this band of about 10 to 12% below normal volumes all the way through the end of May. There was a slightly larger dip that occurred at the end of April, but they quickly recovered from that and are staying in this fairly consistent band. I will note that the tollway has its own set of roadway detectors, and they're reporting very similar trends on their system. The decline in volumes on the tollway system was a little bit larger than what happened on the IDOT system, but they too are seeing week over week increases in traffic volumes. As we move to the next slide, we'll take a look at the impact this is having on average travel speeds. So this chart is looking at the system-wide average for the non-tolled interstates. The vertical axis is travel speed, and along the horizontal axis, we've got show time throughout the day, broken up into 30-minute segments. So the light blue line shows data for the first Wednesday in March. This is a pattern that we would expect to see with normal travel, where there's a decline in average speeds, both in the morning and in the afternoon and early evening, as many people are commuting to and from work. Now, compare that to the dark blue line, which shows an average for all the Wednesdays in May, and we're not seeing any noticeable reductions in travel speed throughout the day. Certainly, localized slowdowns can occur due to crashes or other incidents. But despite this increase in traffic volumes we're seeing, the system as a whole is operating at fairly consistent speeds. And again, data from the tollway are showing the same thing as well. They're really not experiencing any noticeable slowdowns throughout the day. This next slide, we'll take a look at the average number of daily trips that have been occurring on February through May. So this one's going to require me to just do a little bit of setup behind this before I talk about what it's telling us. So this trip information is coming from a big data tool that's actually being provided by IDOT, which includes information collected from cell phones to measure where people are traveling. So this allows us to see the census tracts that people are traveling between. And based on that, we can look at the median household income for those tracts and then assign trips to one of 4 different income categories. So on the chart here, the blue and the orange represent the 2 lower income categories, and the gray and the yellow represent the 2 higher income ones. So I want to highlight just a couple of things that are illustrated on this. The first one being that not all of our residents have been impacted by the pandemic in the same way. So you can see in the first part of the chart from February through mid-March, the trip pattern for all of these income groups is essentially exactly the same. Trips start to decline then as the stay-at-home order is announced, but what we see is that they didn't decline to the same extent for all these groups. So if we look on the chart just after that stay-at-home order line, we can see that the largest declines in trips are seen for the highest income groups in yellow. And this likely reflects the fact that this group not only has greater opportunities to work from home, but also that they have more opportunity to shop online for household supplies. In a previous study that CMAP did, staff looked at the 12 broad occupations that have been classified as essential workers. And that analysis found that essential workers in our region are disproportionately in low-income communities. And this trip data really mirrors those findings. Again, if we look to the right of that stay-at-home order line, and we look at the blue line, which shows the lowest income groups, we see that their travel declined much less than the higher income groups did. And then the other trend on this that I'd like to point out is just that for all 4 of these income categories, we're seeing a clear upward trend in the number of trips that are being taken over the last couple of months. And in fact, that gap that we were seeing between the daily trips made between the lowest income group and highest income group has actually closed somewhat by the end of May. If we move to the next slide, we can see the impact this is having on safety in the region. So this chart, besides reducing congestion, cutbacks in travel from COVID-19 are also reducing the number of serious and fatal injuries resulting from crashes in our region. So this data is just for the city of Chicago, but I still think it provides a useful snapshot for what's going on in the region. This is showing us the cumulative number of serious and fatal injuries from crashes that were reported in March through May of this year, and then data from those same 3 months for the last 2 years. So there's actually 2 sets of data here. So let's look at the green shaded lines at the top of the chart first. This is all serious injuries and fatalities. The 2 lighter green lines are data for 2018 and 2019. And you can see for those 2 years, there were a total of 571 and 508 serious and fatal injuries respectively in those years. For this year, the number is just below 400, so a pretty significant decrease. And we see the same thing if we look at the blue set of lines at the bottom of the chart. Those are serious injuries and fatalities specifically that occurred to cyclists and pedestrians as a result of crashes. Again, we're seeing the 2 lighter lines are data from the last 2 years. We were at 175 and roughly 100 serious and fatal injuries for cyclists and pedestrians. And this year we're at just over 100. So again, a pretty significant decrease we're seeing this year. And finally, for my last slide, let's just take a look at the impact that the pandemic has been having on transit. This should come as no surprise to anyone. There's been an enormous impact on transit ridership while social distancing has been continuing. This data is looking at ridership from May 24th of this year compared to the same day last year. And you can see system-wide ridership is down 79%. If we look at the individual operators, you can see Metro's ridership is down 96%, as downtown commuters are largely still working from home. Ridership on PACE is down 67%. Ridership on CTA buses are also down 67%. And ridership on CTA rail lines is down 87%. So as a result, Metro and PACE have adjusted schedules and altered service to continue supporting people that need to use transit. CTA has generally not cut any service, but they have made operational changes just to make sure that vehicles don't get overcrowded. I do want to note, however, that these ridership numbers are an improvement over what we have been seeing for the past couple of months. So ridership does seem to be slowly increasing again. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay to talk about transportation revenue impacts.
Thanks, Craig. So we wanted to spend some time today also sharing some of our analysis that we've done looking at how the pandemic might actually impact transportation revenues. And we're going to focus on state transportation revenues today. I should start by saying that the impact is really uncertain. Next slide, please. And we don't know exactly when Illinois is going to open up more. And I will also remind everyone that the future impacts of unemployment and business closures on revenue levels is also really uncertain at this point. But as you just heard, the pandemic has already reduced vehicle travel, and it's also impacted other activities that tend to generate transportation revenue for the state and also the region. And these lower revenues are going to affect the transportation investments that will be made in the region by IDOT, as was mentioned by the secretary earlier, by the region's transit agencies, and also by local government transportation departments that are in the region. However, the bright side is that 2020 revenues overall still may wind up being higher than 2019 revenues because, as we all know, conveniently last year, the state increased several revenue sources as part of Rebuild Illinois. So we still may see higher levels than last year, but they're not going to be as high as expected. So we will start by talking about the motor fuel tax. The motor fuel tax is a source that was increased as part of Rebuild Illinois last year. And it's definitely been impacted by reduced vehicle travel already. So if you want to take a look at this table, you can see that we looked at a couple different scenarios for motor fuel taxes for 2020, calendar year 2020, that is. And we assumed different impacts, differing impacts from the pandemic, basically. And we assume that the actual revenues will probably fall somewhere in between the two scenarios we looked at, as represented by those ranges you see on the table. And in that first scenario, you can see that passenger vehicles, we assumed a reduction in VMT at about 15%. And this is based on a scenario where we see lower vehicle miles traveled for about 5 months of 2020. On the second scenario, we assumed that the state would experience significant reductions for about 3/4 of 2020, and that would push passenger vehicle miles traveled down by about 25%. And so what are the results of this? And actually, I think on this chart is missing the labels, but that first column is our baseline 2020 scenario. And you can see that revenues to the region from the motor fuel tax, our baseline forecast was $1.3 billion, but under the pandemic impacts, we're assuming it'll be somewhere between, or we estimate it may be between about 1.1 to 1.2 billion. So that's a reduction of 12 to 20% in motor fuel tax revenues flowing to the region via state investments, local government investments, and the transit agencies. So moving on to some of the other transportation revenues, we looked a bit more specifically at some other sources. For state motor vehicle registration fees and driver's license fees, we're expecting a delay in those revenues because the Secretary of State actually extended expiration dates for those documents until October 1st. What we've seen is that looking at March 6th versus May 29th, active passenger vehicle registrations actually dropped by 6%, likely due to vehicle owners responding to that extension. But we are expecting that to a certain extent, these revenues will go up again in a few months. So user fees like motor vehicle registrations and driver's license fees are actually relatively stable even during economic downturns. With regard to certificate of title fee revenues, and those are the fees paid on new vehicle titles, those went down by about half across April and May. And CMAP had originally estimated that for calendar year 2020, based on the new fee structure approved as part of Rebuild Illinois, that the revenues would come in at about $365 million. But if the current trends continue, we might see a reduction of even $100 million for the calendar year, again, reducing revenues available for the state. And lastly, I did want to touch on the federal revenues flowing to the region. So looking at May 2020, we saw federal highway trust fund receipts of new tax revenue were almost half of what they had been last May. However, we don't actually expect that those decreased revenues will impact the availability of federal funds for Illinois in the short term. That's the situation, though, is that the Highway Trust Fund already faces insolvency, and next year Congress will have to figure out some kind of a solution to deal with that insolvency anyways. So these structural problems that have been occurring for a while now are the more significant policy issue, and there are going to be pandemic impacts, recession impacts to revenues flowing into the Highway Trust Fund, but those changes will probably just mean that the trust fund will be insolvent sooner than was otherwise expected. So moving forward, we're going to continue to track revenues and travel trends. We're going to continue to analyze the impacts, and I will turn it back over to you, Aaron.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Craig, for the detailed overview of some of the work that we've been doing as staff here at CMAP. And I know that the transit agencies and the RTA have additional details that they've been putting out on a weekly basis related to transit ridership as well. So if I could have the next slide. I think the one thing that I wanted to do to ask of the membership here today, you know, we want to, as a long-range planning agency, we want to make sure that the steps that we implement today continue to put us in the direction and the trend of where we want to be by 2050, right? That we aren't making, you know, poor short-term decisions that, you know, don't align with our long-term goals. So, you know, as we continue to think about what we should be doing and what sort of analysis we should be doing, it would be helpful for us to hear a little bit about some of your organization's biggest concerns related to pandemic current activities, but future concerns that you have. I think the other thing too is we're interested to know what sort of information or data you wish you had or need to make decisions, and if there's a role for us to be helpful in that. And then, you know, generally we've been thinking about all of these different issues, and I know many of you have been on task forces that have been considering a number of these questions broadly, but, you know, are there gaps that are out there that you see as missed opportunities for us to come together on as a region? So those are largely, you know, the questions that we have. Again, it's, you know, what sort of role can CMAP fill during these times, and where can we be adding value to the work that you've been doing? So with that, I would just ask if anybody on the policy committee has some thoughts or concerns related to these questions. We'd love to hear your feedback.
Erin, can I just jump in? It's Leanne Redden. You mentioned that the RTA has been putting out and consolidating information. I just want to sort of highlight that. And for anybody who's on this, we have CMAP has graciously included in the last 2-week reviews the link to that data dashboard. It's also available on the front page of our website at rtachicago.org. So that's a good resource for additional data. We update that weekly. It tracks the service board data. We're also doing not only a lot of coordination and conversation with the service boards, but sort of some conversations with the governor's office and others, the city, the county, on thinking about sort of this recovery stuff. So, you know, I encourage everyone to also kind of track and look at that data because it could be useful information for you as well.
Thank you. Other thoughts from committee members? I know that it's challenging to have these sort of interactive, engaging conversations when we aren't all together sitting face to face, but know that this is the type of feedback we're looking for from you as our partners. And if you have additional thoughts or considerations, we are happy to talk with you offline. You can shoot myself or my staff a note, and we're happy to sort of, you know, figure out how we can be of assistance. Oh, and then the secretary, I think you are on mute.
I'm no longer on mute. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a good topic, good discussion. Thank you. Now moving on to item 11, which is the state legislative update, and we would like to hear from Anthony Savali. I hope I didn't butcher your last name, Anthony.
No, sir, that is correct.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Savali. I work with Gordon in the Government Affairs Group here at CMAP. I just wanted to give the state legislative update. None of this is really new to everybody, but yesterday, Governor Pritzker signed into law the FY21 budget and the budget implementation bill. This authorizes nearly $40 billion in general fund spending and an additional $57 billion in other state and federal funds. This budget includes federal COVID-19 relief and represents a substantial increase in operational spending over FY20. A few key highlights. The budget reappropriates the entirety of Rebuild Illinois and includes appropriations for new vertical and horizontal infrastructure projects. It also contains the appropriations for IDOT that include the state share of metropolitan planning and research services, which have historically funded CMAP and the state's 15 other MPOs. Agency budget appropriations at IEPA, IDNR, and DCEO remained consistent with FY20 levels. IDOT received a budget increase for additional staff to manage Rebuild Illinois projects. The ILGA also passed several other bills of interest to CMAP and partners. They include one-year regulatory authorization extensions, which includes the authorization for transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, which was set to expire on June 1st of this year. The General Assembly also passed a property tax provision which delays tax sales and allows non-home rule counties to waive interest penalties. Veto session has already been scheduled and substantive bills were given deadline extensions. The first week will take place from November 17th through November 19th and December 1st through December 3rd. Gordon and I will continue remote outreach to the General Assembly to keep them informed on CMAP's research in response to the pandemic, as well as inform their conversations to the best of our abilities. I'm happy to take any questions you may have at this time.
Any questions for Anthony? Well, thank you, Anthony. And I think you did mention just a little bit about the IDOT headcount. Just wanted to note part of the headcount increase that was given to us is what we have been asking Gambi and the governor's office. We've been asking for their support, specifically on the local agency side. This is an issue that I have been passionate about because I'm very honest and frank about it. We have not historically have done the greatest job in moving the paperwork, so to speak, and the agreement on the phase 1, phase 2, the engineering side of the project. So it has been a concern of mine. So we did ask for about 13 additional staff in here for central office for District 1 all the way through District 9. And I was glad to see that staff and headcount increase have been approved. So I just wanted to make a note of that. And hopefully that would be helpful for us on the long run. And it's not just about staffing. For me, I know we do have, and John Yonan specifically knows a lot about this because we do talk. We do have some inherent inefficiencies in our processes that we are looking into. We're trying to adjust our modeling on how we go about the local agency side of the IDOT business. So thank you. Any question, comments for Anthony? Thank you, Anthony. Now on to the federal update, and it's Jeff Schoenbrecht. I know I did butcher your last name, Jeff, so forgive me for that. So if you would like to update us on the federal update, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My name is Jeff Schnobrecht. I'm a senior policy analyst here at CMAP. Since your last meeting in mid-March, there have been a couple of notable developments in federal transportation policy. So I wanted to touch briefly on the COVID response legislation and then discuss the INVEST Act, which is the House Democrats' surface transportation reauthorization proposal that was released last week. So the CARES Act, as you discussed earlier, the CARES Act was enacted in late March, included significant funding for transit agencies, $25 billion nationwide. These are very flexible funds available for operations and at 100% federal share. That bill also included $80-some billion for the aviation sector, as well as $1 billion for Amtrak. But this is the only transportation funding that has actually been enacted at this point. So what the CARES Act didn't include was any funding for state DOTs, which the Secretary mentioned earlier, for tollway agencies or general relief funds for local governments. So to address some of those items, about a month ago, the House passed the HEROES Act, which did include general purpose relief for states and localities, an additional $16 billion for transit, and an additional and $15 billion for state DOTs. Though the Senate hasn't taken up that bill, and it doesn't appear that they will address additional COVID relief or stimulus until late July at the earliest. So that's the state of COVID relief. Now moving to the INVEST Act. So if Congress had a tendency to do its work on time, we would probably be in the midst of surface transportation reauthorization talks, since the programs expire in just 3 months. Instead, those conversations are in some ways just beginning. But the House took a big step last week when it released the Investing in a New Vision for the Environment and Surface Transportation, or Invest in America Act. So this is sort of step 2 in a long process of reauthorization, with step 1 being the Senate EPW committee releasing its highway portion of the bill last summer. Now, the House Democrats had released a framework document in January, but what they released last week was actual bill text that we can really analyze. And so before I get into some of the content there, just 2 notes. 1, the bill was not released on a bipartisan basis, so it is just at this point a product of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Democrats. And the second big issue is that it doesn't identify a source of funding for the new spending that it calls for. So as Lindsay mentioned earlier, that Highway Trust Fund insolvency is left unaddressed at this point by this bill. So in terms of content, we continue to review the bill. It's 850 pages and there is a lot to get through, but some of the basics. It starts with a 1-year extension of existing policy and funding, with additional funding for states and transit agencies to respond to COVID-related revenue issues. And then after that, it's 4 years of new policies and programs. So it would be a 5-year total bill, which matches the length of the FAST Act. It does include significantly higher funding levels than the current program. It's a 62% overall authorization increase compared to the FAST Act, but again, with no identified source for that funding. And a number of sort of themes or emphases of the legislation really focuses on fix it first, really focuses on climate programs and greenhouse gas reductions, bike ped programs, mass transit, and bridge improvements. So in terms of more detail, and again, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this bill and going over it all would take too long. But what I'm going to do now is just provide a quick overview of how the bill lines up with CMAP's reauthorization principles. So we developed these principles and released them earlier this year, and they are derived from the recommendations of ONDA 2050. So there are 5 of them. The first one is ensure sustainable funding. And this principle is really not supported by the bill, at least at this point, because there is no sustainable revenue source identified. It does have some provisions related to a road usage charge or VMT fee, but nothing sustainable in the short term. Our second principle is to align funding with national performance goals. And this principle is also generally not supported by this bill. The bill keeps the existing funding distributions, to states which are not currently performance-based. It does have some interesting provisions related to transportation access, which is good, but overall the principle is generally not met. Our third principle is support for goods movement and address community impacts. And this principle is largely supported. So the freight formula program is continued and made fully multimodal. There are various provisions to mitigate the negative impacts of grade crossings, which is particularly important in our region. There is also a sort of replacement for the infra program that would help with very large projects that are difficult to fund with existing funding streams. And then sort of symbolic, but I think important, the national freight policy would be amended to make it a goal explicitly to decrease adverse impacts of freight transportation on communities near freight facilities and corridors. And we have plenty of those in the region, so I think that is a notable provision. CMAP's fourth reauthorization principle is address climate change. This is largely supported by the bill, probably where this bill most shines. There's a new national highway goal of combating climate change, new performance measure for greenhouse gas emissions, a slew of new programs related to climate change, carbon pollution reduction, resilience and emergency evacuation, new program for electric vehicle charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, and then a competitive program for non-state applicants for projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The bill would also require MPOs like us and states to develop vulnerability assessments. We as an MPO would also be required to include climate change and resilience in the planning process, which CMAP largely has done in ONDA 2050, but it would formalize that, be a few additional requirements, and would make that a nationwide requirement. The bill also adds eligibilities for resilience in various highway programs. And then there are a number of provisions that sort of support climate goals in a more broad way, which, emphasizing fix it first, requiring a higher bar for new roadway capacity within the NHPP program. And then the bill also includes a significant increase in funding for transit, which we know can help meet some of our climate goals. The last principle is establish a stronger role for regions. We find that this principle is somewhat supported by the bill. There would be a new Metro Performance Program, which would provide direct allocations of funding to high-performing MPOs, as identified by USDOT, to choose projects. And then you discussed UWP earlier. So metropolitan planning funding in this bill would be substantially increased by about 40% in the second year of the bill and growing after that. So those are the 5 principles. Again, there's a lot more in the bill. This is just a broad overview. The Transportation Infrastructure Committee is set to mark this bill up next Wednesday, June 17th. And as I mentioned, this is just sort of step 2 in a long process that involves lots of other committees and negotiations. Most observers, myself included, think that it's unlikely that programs will be reauthorized by the September 30th deadline. And in fact, the first portion of the bill is written such that it could function as a 1-year extension of existing programs. So it's basically severable in that way. So it seems that some sort of extension is the direction we're heading. But this is an important development in that it gets actual legislative text and sort of puts the House Democrats' stake in the ground in terms of what they're looking for in a bill. So that's a lot of information. There's a lot more in the bill. I'll stop now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Any discussion, any question?
Jeff, this is Chris from DuPage County. You mentioned, I think it was 15 billion or something to states. Is that revenue replacement due to lost MFT?
So the 15 billion that I mentioned was in the HEROES Act. So that's, yeah, COVID response legislation. That would be sort of general revenue replacement. It would have really broad eligibility for administrative costs, basically anything that state DOTs would want to spend their money on. But that is, again, part of the House passed package that hasn't been addressed by the Senate.
Okay.
Right. Yes, and Chris, that does include, and I think Jeffrey will refer to it, including payroll. So it's quite flexible. It's not meant to strictly make up for the MFT. And it's not really what the state DOTs have wanted to begin with. For long term, it was our original package. We were actually last year we were looking for about 50 billion rather package as a relief, but at least we're not saying no to the 15 billion, so that you know. We have seen it as far as IDOT is concerned. Obviously, we have spent quite a lot of extra on our overhead dealing with COVID, including our highway maintainers, including distribution of needed material, including readjusting our day-to-day work. So that took some extra, obviously, budget money from us. That would be a good relief for us. In the meantime, when you look at other DOTs have went to the point of actually furloughing people, reducing their staff, Ohio being one, or going and asking at least the upper level of staff to take a reduction in their salary, North Carolina being one, our neighbor in Missouri being the other. So a lot of people had to take some drastic action. We were lucky enough at IDOT here not to go that route, and that is a testament, part of it, to the Capitol bill and the Gombe folks and the governor office ensuring that we continue our essential business. So thank you, Jeff, though. Appreciate the rendition. So on to item 13, other businesses. Are there any other businesses? And I see a note here that committee members joining the meeting late should verbally make themselves known. So if somebody joined this late, would they identify themselves, please?
Yes, it's Garland Armstrong calling. How you doing?
Good, good.
All right. Just want y'all to know that we need to have a good comprehensive policy, especially to get a reform for the police to make sure that to communicate to every residents, even visitors. After you heard in the news what's happening right now of the riots and the looting, we need a good comprehensive policy plan to make sure that everybody from all walks of life be inclusive in there, and then have good communication, because there's a disconnect in different parts of the communities that feel like they're out of touch. So we need a good policy on that and make sure that everyone gets all of it in together. So we're all in this together. So we need to make sure that they get a good comprehensive policy bill for it.
Thank you, Garland. I know the mayor's talked about this yesterday a little bit, Secretary, about how, Chairman Bennett mentioned that this is top of mind for many of the mayors of our region, just given all the unrest that's been going on. So I will just note for the Secretary that Rocco joined the tollway representing Jose Alvarez. So that was the only other member that I knew we hadn't read.
Good morning, Rocco.
Jose Alvarez was joined a little late, so I'm here.
Welcome.
Get me in trouble, Aaron.
Sorry.
Good. Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, thank you. And now to item 15, which talks about our next meeting, and it's going to be on October 14th with the CMAP board. So it's going to be a joint meeting, right? Thank you.
Yes.
So if there are no other comments, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved, CDOT.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second from the Council of Mayors.
Thank you. Motion is seconded. If there are no questions, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
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 Those opposed and who would want to stick around much longer signify by a vote of no. Thank you. The motion carries and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.